Let's see what Dr. Jarvis has for me to edit today.
Nice.
All right.
Howdy, y'all. I'm Dr. Jeff Jarvis. Now that we have been calling online medical control for cardiac arrest termination for a few months, I've been getting some questions about why I ask y'all to do some things that might seem a little odd at the end of a cardiac arrest.
What you talking about, Willis?
I want to explain why I do this and provide some context that might help y'all understand my rationale for doing this. So if you haven't experienced it yet, when you call me for a termination, depending on what the circumstances are, I may ask you to hold compressions but continue ventilating for a couple of minutes before I give you the time of death. Now, I know this can be confusing since we spend so much time working to minimize compression, interruption, and then being asked to do that intentionally. It just goes against everything we've been working on, and it seems weird. So I know that. So that's why I want to explain what I'm doing here. So the context for this is important. If I ask you to do it, it's because I've already determined, based on what you've told me, that further efforts at resuscitation are almost certainly futile. In other words, I've already made up my mind to terminate the resuscitation. Let me give you some history on why I do this. I first started calling arrest as a medical director as opposed to in person as an ER doc in 2011 when I was medical director at Williamson County. Now, that system was very good at providing high-quality pit crew CPR. They generated really high CO2 levels, even far into the resuscitation. It wasn't unusual for me to be asked to do a termination on a patient with end-tidal CO2 levels in the 90s. Now, I knew that 40 minutes of asystole was bad.
Oh my God, I did. Is this bad? Is this bad?
It's still bad no matter how you slice it, regardless of what the end-tidal CO2 was. But I typically assumed that higher levels were predictive of better outcomes. And to be honest, I wasn't sleeping very well after some of these calls. Now, as an aside, there have been several studies now looking at the predictive value of end-tidal CO2 in cardiac arrest, and the bottom line, it's not as helpful as we once thought it was. So, back to what I'm doing. I was at dinner one night with a good friend and mentor of mine, the late Dr. Craig Manifold. I told him I was coming across these situations frequently and they were really bothering me. Well, he told me what he did in these situations, and I've since adapted this practice, and I call it the manifold technique. Now, the theory behind these end-tidal CO2 values in cardiac arrest is that there must be some type of metabolism going on to generate those values. By holding compressions, we should see sustained levels if that's really what's going on, meaning there is really high values because of underlying metabolism, as opposed to, say, really good compressions. So that's why I have you hold the compressions. All right, so what about ventilations? Why do we keep doing that? Well, because of the way the machine works. It only reads CO2 at the end of expiration. That's what the end tidal part means. In other words, no ventilations, no end tidal CO2 values. So that's why we hold compressions and continue ventilating. So let's take a look at what I'm expecting to see here. I'm expecting that within a minute or so of holding compressions, we should see a pretty significant drop in CO2 levels. Now, a typical case may have values in the 80s, and those start to drop off profoundly within 30 seconds, maybe getting into the 20s or lower within just a minute. Now, if that doesn't happen and those values remain high, I got to start looking at other things that may be going on, things like chronic CO2 retention in a COPD patient, or maybe bicarb use, just as examples. Now, when I see those end-tidal CO2 values drop that quickly, it helps assure me of futility and I end up sleeping better after calling the code. And I think when y'all understand this and you see the same thing, it'll help y'all sleep better too. Now, there's one last situation I want to talk about, and that's PEA. PEA honestly can be tough. Asystole, not so much. That's pretty easy. But PEA can be challenging because it can be the last gasp of a dying heart, but it could also be something we call pseudo-PEA. That's a perfusing rhythm that just happens to have such profound hypotension that you can't feel a pulse. Now, pseudo-PEA is more likely with faster and narrower rhythms than it is with slower and wider ones. And that's why I'm always going to ask you to describe what the rhythm looks like when you tell me they're in PEA, because as it turns out, all PEA isn't created equally. Now, if it's that last gasp type of PEA, then what we're typically going to see is the rate's going to slow and the complex is going to get wider. It's going to turn into bradyasystolic PEA. That's the idioventricular rhythms. And that's what we're expecting to see in compressions. Again, if we see the heart rate go up, we see consistent, narrow, rapid PEA with sustained end tidal, then I'm really thinking more pseudo-PEA. Now, every once in a while, when we're doing this, when we're holding compressions but continuing to ventilate, we get pulses back. We can now feel them. Now, although this is likely to be just an artifact of the epinephrine, we are obviously going to treat it as the ROSC that it is, and we're going to transport. Now, the best way to determine the difference between true and pseudo-PEA is with an ultrasound probe. And that is why I am so eager to get point-of-care ultrasound in the field. Now, we don't have them here, obviously. The good news is that we do have a pathway to get them in the near future. Chief Davis and I have been talking about some funding mechanisms, and we got some pretty promising leads. I'm optimistic that we're going to see it within the next year or so. I really appreciate his support on this, and I think y'all are going to love having these things available. Now, the last thing I want to mention about this is that holding compressions in a resuscitation is something only a physician can authorize during an online medical control call. Please do not do this on your own. I started to see some of my partners in Wilco doing this before calling me for a termination. Just don't do it, please. I want y'all to continue to approach every arrest as though it's survivable right up until we tell you to terminate. Now, again, we're only going to ask you to do this once we've heard enough to make a preliminary determination of futility. Now, finally, this is something I'm really comfortable doing because I've been doing it for 13 years. But other docs may not feel that way, and they may not ask you to do it. Again, I just wanted to bring this up because I've been getting some questions about it, and I think those are fair questions, and I think it's only fair for me to explain my rationale and what I'm expecting to see. All right, that's it. Thanks, as always, for everything y'all do out there every day to care for our community. Take care, y'all.